Hey, it's Soul with another video. Check out the amazing people on the right as well as the list of people at the end of this video. Those are the sponsors that keep this machine running so I can keep doing all of this and, well, let's just get started. Once upon a time there were two factions, the Horde and the Alliance. They fought a lot. The end. Two warring factions. That's the foundation of the Warcraft franchise, and it's reflected throughout its universe, from orcs versus humans, to the living versus the dead, friends versus traitors, light versus darkness, etc., etc. The World of Warcraft is a game. It's a platform where we play as so-called champions of the Horde or the Alliance. I'm gonna say champions a lot throughout this video, so bear with me. And we do things to collect loot, toys, mounts, cool cosmetics, and of course, to slay one another. This rivalry was born and very much raised thanks to the World of Warcraft, where players choose sides and they are essentially divided. The earlier RTS games inspired some loyalty in a favorite race to play for gameplay reasons, but the emotional investment to our factions in the World of Warcraft, they might not be shared among all of its players, but for those who are, it is on a different level. So what are we here to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about what is possible in the future of the World of Warcraft regarding the factions and our relationship to these factions as players. But think of this as just a thought exercise. This is fan fiction, fantasy, it's wild speculation, whatever you want to think of it. I don't have a strong basis that any of this is what's to come, except that, well, it's remotely possible, yeah? Today we have players that are split up among two factions. I did make an attempt to set up the framework for how the World of Warcraft can implement a fully fledged third faction. I tried like really hard. I even watched a piece from Taliesin that he did on like a possible third faction. I watched it a bunch of times. I watched it once, but without getting too detailed, it just wouldn't work in a way that was fun. Okay, thinking about it was a whole lot of fun. Imagining who might be in this third faction, that was fun. But how to jam all that into a game with 14 years worth of development and faction history and the player investment? All the ideas that I came up with, it turned out to just be confusing, cumbersome, costly, all of these negative C words. I just couldn't get players excited about the possibility of a third faction, and I'd rather drum up something that is possibly interesting and could make players happy. Fancy that. I'm gonna revisit an old idea that I had way back, like maybe months ago, I think, where I reimagined the World of Warcraft if there was only one faction of us, the adventurers. Unfortunately, that video didn't take off. I guess I just didn't present it very well, especially when I had to ask you, the viewers, to pretend that we never had factions in the first place. Instead of trying to go back and rewrite the World of Warcraft, I'm going to take what we have and look forward to see how things can be shifted around. So today's presentation with this really long intro might not be received very well either, because for many of you, being associated with your faction it's just part of your DNA now. Being a member of the Horde or the Alliance is just built into your bones.
Please, oh my god, Soul, don't do it. Don't take it away from me.
But I'm gonna try to do it anyway. I'm going to start off by making up a story, speculating on what is going to happen at the end of this current expansion, the Battle for Azeroth. And the war between the Horde and Alliance will have gotten super brutal. Throughout this expansion, Azeroth is going to have gone through war between the Alliance and the Horde, and then the rise of Nazjatar and the coming of N'Zoth. Naturally, the two sides, the Horde and Alliance, are going to turn their attention towards this greater threat, whoop-de-doo, big surprise, and then somehow, some way, get through it. But unlike previous times where uniting against this greater big bad thing leads to this uneasy truce, the factions aren't going to skip a beat, and they'll go right back at going at each other's throats. Because Sylvanas, let's just blame her, it's much easier. Let's just presume that she got some old god technology or something, and then she just goes ham. She just goes way too far, pulling everyone into this devastating, brutal, worldwide conflict. By the end of this blood war, the capitals will have been devastated. Armies are fighting to the last man. Big character deaths are more than bound to happen, and all the while we, the players, the champions, are getting caught up in it. We're just following orders, doing whatever our faction leaders say, until we come to this moment where something just insane happens. Something insane is just going to happen at the end of this expansion or at the end of the last raid or something like that will bring this war to a convincing and satisfying end. It has to come to some conclusion that will satisfy players. Otherwise, it's going to give this entire war, this entire expansion, pretty much no meaning. Maybe we can even consider that there is a winner to the war, but the cost of victory will be so high that is it really going to matter? So I'm going to speculate that this war is going to end with the two big governments, the Horde and the Alliance, in disarray. They're in shambles. A lot of them are still alive, they're still banded together, but for the most part, their infrastructure, their capability, it's in ruins. Meanwhile, the survivors are going to turn to us, the champions. They're going to ask, hey, what are you going to do now? Are you going to help your faction rebuild what was lost? And in this moment of clarity, here's the big kicker. The champion is going to answer, no, we won't. Because we, the players, have been fighting in the interest of our factions for what? Like, it's going to be 15 years by the time we get to the end of this expansion? And this madness, all this chaos and ruination this is how it all turned out. And we've had it. We're just sick and tired of this shit. Tired of being the blunt instrument of our faction leaders. So we decide that instead of being propped up as the faction's champion once again, we're going to step back or step away, however you want to paint it, and reevaluate our place in the world while helping out others, like killing boars and picking up nuts and squirrels and stuff. So people of the Horde and the Alliance, don't call me champion anymore. At the end of the battle for Azeroth, we players as adventurers are going to step away from the limelight and into this gritty, scarred world that was nearly ruined by war. Just like previous expansions, the final moments of the battle for Azeroth are going to set the premise for the next expansion. In this case, it's going to be picking up the pieces of this post-war Azeroth where the Horde and Alliance, they still exist, but in a minor way, where we still represent them. I'm still a person of the Horde, yeah, but they at least no longer have the presence or the swagger that they once had. Instead, going forward, while the factions are cleaning up their own mess, we players as adventurers are going to venture out into this new frontier. Essentially, the world of Warcraft is going to go through a kind of reset thanks to this super climactic war and put us in an uneasy climate that's not unlike vanilla WoW, but with changes, Going forward, when questing out in whatever the heck new land Blizzard puts us in, if we run into someone who is of the opposite faction, guess what? Now we can talk to each other. We can even party together, go into dungeons and raid and PvP, I guess I'm going to put a big asterisk over there. There's going to be a lot of caveats to that. Gameplay-wise, here's what's going to happen. Everything that the level 1 to 120 experience is going to stay intact. All the systems are still pretty much the same with a few modifications. Overall, the experience should feel unchanged. So let's start with what happens when you make a brand new character. You're still going to select your home faction, as well as your race and class and whatever. You're going to start your game and level up in your home zone. You're going to do quests like normal. You're probably going to want to avoid the opposite factions' towns and capitals because you're going to get your ass killed. That stuff has not changed. But here's what does. You'll be able to talk to and party with players from the opposite faction seamlessly. Queue up for dungeons, walk into raids, go ahead. Out in the open world, you can also party up, but keep in mind the old world and the low-level content. You can complete neutral, non-faction specific quests and quest lines together because they're pretty much the same thing. However, a Horde player isn't going to be able to pick up Alliance-only quests and vice versa. I'm talking about this at a very simple and very high level, but that's pretty much it. I know that there are lots of caveats and questions and challenges to this, but I want to move things along. For the most part, the World of Warcraft should feel the same all the way up until you reach this brand new expansion content, but even then, it should still feel pretty familiar. So let's skip to that. The BFA content is all done, and now you're introduced into this new land, somewhere really exotic. Let's call it Idaho, all right? So you're in the land of Idaho, which is not under the influence of the Horde nor the Alliance governments because they're too busy rebuilding after the war. The faction experience is going to be reminiscent of World of Warcraft Legion, where the story didn't care about the faction divide. In fact, it was the start of Legion that was dedicated to removing the Horde and Alliance divide from most of the story because of the whole Broken Shore stuff. The only exceptions to that was some questing in Stormheim and
Grey means 4! forces hold this warden.
Oh, don't you miss that? Everybody was considered a defender of Azeroth, united in neutral areas like Dalaran, Deliverance Point on the Broken Shore, the Vindicar over in Argus, and the only separation there was with the class orders and their respective quest lines. Unlike Battle for Azeroth, with its very unique set of quests and campaigns for the two factions, this quest content is going to be largely shared. So potentially, if Blizzard put in the same work, we could maybe get like twice the amount of quest content. We just happen to be able to do all of it with one faction. Somewhere down the line can be a spattering of quest content that is unique to your faction, because the conflict isn't going away. You're still a part of the Horde and Alliance. It's just been massively, massively de-escalated. And they haven't forgotten what you've done. The interactions and quests, they're going to be no less important, but they're going to be just not as plentiful because they're not the main story. You'll see pockets of their presence to help tell the story of the war's aftermath, but don't expect to get a sudden quest from Anduin out of nowhere that summons you to his throne. As another example, if you're exploring these new lands as an orc, you might run into a caravan that could use some help, but it's a human caravan. They want nothing to do with you, but if you happen to be a night elf, even though you and this orc person are partied together, well, that night elf is going to see a quest. And of course, it'll work both ways. The main story experience, though, is going to be shared. This new chapter in Azeroth is going to have a theme that takes or borrows elements from Miss Pandaria and Legion. It's going to be a new land with a cast of new characters, a couple of cameos from people that are returning. It's going to be an adventure for adventurers, helping others and resolving conflicts. And that'll be the premise of the World of Warcraft moving forward, where the meaning of choosing your race is mostly going to determine where you're going to be leveling in older content. And of course, there are other things to consider, like cosmetics, racial abilities, some of the other quest types in current content, and so on. Otherwise, the idea of players being separated by this impenetrable faction line is going to be phased out. Faction identity is not going to go away. I want to stress that very hard. However, it is going to be secondary. You might be thinking, hey Sol, that's actually not a bad idea. Just kidding, this thing is total dog shit. I love beating Horde faces into the ground and screw this Care Bear sort of crap, right? And that's fine. All you have to do is turn on War Mode. It's not going to take away from the overall gameplay. In fact, it's definitely going to give you that Legion sort of feel, because there's still going to be adventures to be had, but if you still hold a grudge in this post-war Azeroth, well, you're still more than free to fight it out. Invade capitals, fight in the city streets, go for it. Funny enough, it's thanks to War Mode that makes this entire concept even possible. It ensures that Warcraft, or the World of Warcraft, can still retain its identity of the endless conflict between Alliance and Horde. It's just that now we have a very clear separation of who wants to get along and who does not. A question that typically comes up in these kinds of conversations is, what about changing allegiances? I'm not a big fan of this myself, but let's just explore this for a little bit. It's important to point out that even though the adventurers are capable, they have the choice of whether or not they want to get along in this concept, it doesn't exactly mean that the cities that were once hostile with you are now fully functional and friendly. If you're a goblin, you're not going to be able to simply walk into Stormwind and use their auction house. But maybe, this is definitely off the top of my head, maybe in the new expansion, you can do some sort of reputable quest line at max level, and that will get you enough reputation to be at least neutral with those cities. Because you probably did slaughter a lot of their people. I don't see my Blood Elf being exalted with Stormwind. At best, I can go in there without being killed. Of course, if I have War Mode on, then all bets are off and I'll probably get my ass beat. And maybe this would result in you losing reputation with the home faction, your original faction, but I'm just going to stop there and I'll let you folks discuss that side of thing in the comments. So what about the future of the World of Warcraft? Because the Horde and Alliance, they're going to be done licking their wounds eventually, and they're going to want to reassert themselves on the world stage at some point. There's going to be a legitimate question of how is that going to work out? And I suspect that as long as the story doesn't go back to another all-out war, we can just go back to this uneasy tension that we had like the good old days. The small difference here is that the overall story will be driven by two kinds of narratives that are always going forward. One is the main storyline of the patch or the expansion, whatever that is, and the other is the ever-present faction story. And we've been seeing this for many, many expansions now. With Battle for Azeroth as the exception, there's always been a bigger emphasis on neutral factions or common threats that bring us, the adventurers, together. After a few aches and pains, and there will most definitely be some, I believe that most players are going to grow accustomed to being around each other, just like they were before in Shatrath and Dalaran again and the Vindikar and whatever the heck next neutral hub there is. Or you can just leave war mode on and nothing really is going to change. It's going to feel just like an old school PvP server. The biggest drawback that I see is that when it comes to the story and narrative, Blizzard won't be able to go back into an all-out war between the Horde and Alliance, which might be good for some, but this also dilutes or even compromises faction pride altogether, which is a big staple of the franchise. To a lesser extent, there's certainly going to be awkwardness in areas that I didn't really talk about much, like queuable PvP and legacy content that is faction specific, so pretty much all of the Battle for Azeroth expansion. I do think that there's a big challenge with tackling that, but I don't think that because of that this concept is a non-starter. I think that this can work despite it. So to summarize, I believe that Blizzard is fully capable of writing a story that will leave Azeroth devastated by a war to the point where we as players shed our role as champions and venture out to help others in our own way, in a very similar way to the Legion story and quest framework. Downgrading our legions to our factions is going to let more players play together, which I think is a very good thing, and war mode will still allow others to practice their old ways. So that's it. Are you impressed? I both fixed and ruined the world of Warcraft at the same time. This is always a fun topic to talk about, so I encourage your thoughts and comment below or over in the Discord channel. There's a link below. Please like the video if you enjoyed yourself, and otherwise I hope to see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.